From increased tension to a leadership summit, 2023 was a down and up year in China-U.S. relations. We look at the highlights. Could it lay the groundwork for improved ties in 2024? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Relations between China and the United States ebbed and flowed this past year. Both sides made serious efforts to improve their relationship, culminating with that November summit between President Xi and President Biden in San Francisco. There was agreement on some issues, but differences remain on others. Both sides did, however, acknowledge there's still much work to be done. And there's much to talk about. Let's get straight to our panel. Robert Hormats is a visiting lecturer at Yale University and a former U.S. Undersecretary of State. Liang teaches economics as a chair professor at Willamette University. Also with us is James P. Moore. He's the founder and CEO of the Washington Institute for Business, Government and Society. And Victor Gao is a chair professor at Soochow University. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Victor, let's start with that summit that took place in San Francisco in November between President Xi and President Biden. It took place on the sidelines of the APEC leaders meeting that was taking place in the city at the same time. It was an important meeting. These two leaders had only met a year before, in November of 2022, in Bali at the G20 summit. So how significant was this meeting in San Francisco?
Thank you very much for having me. The San Francisco summit, which predated the G20 meeting in San Francisco, was a very important landmark event for China and U.S. relations, both in terms of optics, but also in terms of substance. After the meeting, it is very important to see whether the United States is walking the walk as they talk the talk in San Francisco. From the Chinese perspective, there has been dissatisfactions and disappointment that they believe that the United States was not walking the right walk as President Biden was talking the right talk in San Francisco. So the taste of the pudding is still in the eating of it. I think we need to really mobilize the two countries to do the right thing, to move in the right direction, so that the bilateral relations are not only stabilized, but will be moving in the positive, constructive construction. In the world of today, neither China nor the United States could afford to view the other as the antagonist, because eventually it's not going to be helpful, it's not going to be constructive. The two sides need to overcome their differences and get along with each other for mutual benefit, and that's the best way for China-U.S. relations going forward.
Victor, looking at that meeting, I mean, there was agreement on some issues. There was agreement, for instance, on the export of fentanyl starter materials. There was also an acknowledgement by both sides on the risks of using AI in military applications. So, on balance, what did the summit achieve?
Well, you mentioned the several achievements, but also the restoration of the military-to-military communication, especially at the theater level, is, I think, very important. And I think you talked about the fentanyl. China has a track record of fighting against drug abuse of all kinds. And I think China will be very happy to cooperate with the United States to the extent possible in coming up with joint actions to minimize the drug impact in the United States. Now, the very important thing, I would say, the San Francisco summit restored the state-to-state level exchange between China and the United States. They actually restore the channels of communication, especially in terms of the military-to-military communication. This is absolutely important. You talked about AI. I think both China and the United States should realize sooner rather than later that AI, if left unattended to, will be a fundamental menace to Homo sapien, to mankind as a whole. And neither China nor the United States could come out of this as a winner. Therefore, the sooner China and the United States start cooperation or coming up with a framework of coordination in AI, it will be good, positive, not only for China and the United States, but for mankind as a whole. I don't hope our future generation will be lost to the dominance of AI, and Homo sapien will lose their superiority or supremacy in the world of today.
Robert, Victor there was talking about the reopening of military-to-military dialogue. That was one of the achievements of that summit that took place in San Francisco. You've long been a proponent of dialogue. In fact, you wrote a piece in May of last year in Fortune magazine, and I think it's fair to say that the thrust of that piece was that China and the United States need to conduct more high-level meetings. There needs to be more dialogue in order for them to mend their differences.
Yes, that's my point of view. I think that having gone back to the early days, 1972, 73, when Kissinger and Nixon were having a series of conversations with Chairman Mao Zedong and Premier Zhou Enlai and others, the key point was to have a framework of personal relations and a framework of substantive relations and a framework of mutual trust. And I think that you don't get those kinds of relationships without a frequent set or relatively frequent set of conversations between the top leaders of the two countries. And I think that what has happened, both as a result of the talks in San Francisco, which I think were quite productive, but also meetings between the top foreign officials of both countries, finance ministers, trade ministers, and other ministers, environment and others. Those are a start, and the ministers themselves have set up lower level dialogues between the two countries. Those don't guarantee results, however, but they provide a format, a framework,
right,
a channel for at least enabling each side to explain its point of view and to determine where they differ and where they agree, and where they agree, see if they can narrow the differences that they have now, and where they don't agree, at least manage it in such a way that it doesn't lead to confrontation between the two countries.
And Robert, on that specific agreement on reopening military-to-military dialogue, how significant was that?
Extremely significant. I think that there's always a risk when you have two superpowers with their ships and their planes coming very close to one another, that mistakes will be made, or miscalculations will be made, or accidents can happen that neither country intends. And to have conversations between the two military leaders and others in the military framework of both countries,
right,
that's to avoid these kinds of miscalculations or mistakes that tend to happen even between close allies. There are mistakes or miscalculations, or errors that need to be corrected.
Okay.
And I think U.S. and China, there needs to be a dialogue to avoid mistakes on both sides.
Young Liang, great to see you. Let's talk about trade. I mean, despite these strained relations between the two countries, trade is still very, very strong. In fact, China is America's third largest trade partner. That's after Canada and Mexico. Chinese imports into the U.S. was worth $563 billion last year. Although there was a narrowing in the amount of goods, in the volume of goods, but still 563 billion. What do you make of the trade relationship?
Yeah, good to talk to you, Anand. So I think the trade relationship is very important. As you just mentioned, last year the two-way trade reached $758 billion, and there was a 19% increase year on year. So that just means, despite all these talks about the political rhetoric, about decoupling or de-risking, I think at the business level, at the trade level, two countries still have a lot of ground to cooperate. This is despite the Trump administration's punitive tariffs. Now is already 5 years in a row that $250 billion worth of Chinese imports are still subject to 25% of the tariff rate. So this is very high. And yet, I think this did not prevent two countries from trading with each other. That said, I think the Biden administration has been insistent on the so-called de-risking strategies. That means the export ban on these high-tech exports to China, and yet at the same time they worried about the trade imbalances, the deficits. And at the same time, they're not willing to ship, these semiconductor chips that China wants. They're also, banning or restricting investments in quantum computing, in AI, in semiconductor industries in China. And last but not the least, they're also putting many Chinese companies on their entity list, preventing them from cooperating. So I think there's still a lot of economic headwinds between the two countries, but I think at commercial and business level, we see a lot of intentions, a lot of efforts to continue to trade with each other.
Right, Liang, you mentioned the political rhetoric. It has had something of an impact. I mean, there are a number of U.S. companies that have reduced their business ties with China. How serious is that?
Well, I think, first of all, there are companies that are adopting the so-called China Plus One strategies, which is they want to diversify their supply chain. That doesn't necessarily mean, their overall footprint in China will be reducing. It just means that they may expand the businesses, but some of those productions or supply chain is going to go into other countries. At the same time, I think a lot of tech companies, they still want to do business with China. A lot of the business executives do say, China is such a big market. And for example, Text Instruments, they have 48% revenues are earned from China. Many, and Qualcomm, over 60% of their revenues are from China. And let's not forget, the USDA sent the largest delegate to the Chinese CIIE, the China International Import Expo, and they're trying to promote agricultural exports to China. So I think that just goes to show that, China is such an important market and such an important player in the global supply chain. I don't think that businesses would completely just trying to cut off China.
James, the United States ambassador to China, Nicholas Burns, he says he's not optimistic about future relations, but at the same time he said that he is hopeful and realistic. We also heard during the past year from the Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo. She calls China, quote, the biggest threat to the United States. How do you see this relationship?
Well, honestly, as we're sitting here in December of 2023, there's the tendency to be able to think that we're going into a brand new year in which everything will be very optimistic, will be very, very productive. But I think we're going to have a very difficult year ahead of us. It's clear, for example, that with the military-to-military dialogue that was established, or at least the declaration was made, that we were going to see closer contact with one another. I have yet to see any evidence that there's been much of anything that's happened since that San Francisco summit. It's quite something to realize that we have had in the House of Representatives a select committee on China that just released a report that showed that there were 150 different areas in which there was concern on the future relationship between the United States and China, and a concern about how to be able to deal with all of these things. But at the very least, we have people like the Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, who is going to be leaving the United States for China in 2024 to continue the dialogue. And to what Bob Hormats was saying, it is extremely important that we continue to have that kind of dialogue, because there's an awful lot that can go wrong if we don't.
Right, Victor, what did you make of what James tells us about these concerns that were raised in that report produced by a bipartisan group in Congress?
Well, I think the fundamental basis for these concerns is what the United States want China to become, whether China is a competitor, is a rival, or is an antagonist, or eventually as a strategic enemy, or is China a normal country which can get along with the United States, and the two countries, despite all their differences, should do their best to get along with each other. Meaning your God for me and my Buddha for me, for example, your God for you and my Buddha for me. We do not want to interfere in each other's domestic politics. We do not want to interfere in the political system or ideology of the other country. I think if we can move to a higher level of analysis, China and the United States have all the reason to get along with each other, rather than, for example, the United States try to impose its version of the truth on China, or vice versa.
The point, Victor, is that, I mean, there were some positive developments over the past year. I mean, we had a string of cabinet-level officials from the United States visiting China for talks with Chinese officials. And I'm wondering, you know, is the U.S. Approach to China a little bit schizophrenic? I mean, on the one hand, we hear administration officials tell us that they do sincerely want to improve relations, but on the other hand, we hear from people like Gina Raimondo, who says China remains a serious threat. And of course, as James mentioned, there's that report in Congress raising all these concerns. How does China respond to that?
I met with Secretary Gina Raimondo in Yale University end of October. I actually asked her direct questions. And I would say, if she says China is a threat, be specific. Where does China threaten the United States? And how China and the United States can work together to overcome whatever threats that Gina or any other U.S. government officials may have in their mind. I don't think China is a threat. If Gina Raimondo thinks China's steady economic development is a threat, China will develop. China will surpass the size of the United States if we use official exchange rate. If you believe in Elon Musk, by the middle of the century, the size of the Chinese economy will be doubling the size of that of the United States. That in itself is not a threat. I think if there is a real threat between China and the United States, that threat should be interpreted as U.S. trying to impose its version of the truth on China, or vice versa. Other than that, we can get along despite of our differences. And the positive, constructive relations will be beneficial for both the Chinese people and the American people.
James, when you hear those differences that Victor's talking about there, does that speak directly to something that Robert mentioned, which is the building of trust between these two sides?
Absolutely. First of all, I think it's important that if there are issues related to what exactly are the problems that exist between the United States and China right now, I think all we have to do is look at that report that's just come out by the House committee. And indeed, the framing of it used the terminology that the United States is concerned that China wants to turn the United States into an economic vassal. And so that's the sort of thing where you need to be able to get into the weeds and to be able to figure out exactly why there are these kinds of concerns that continue here, but certainly on the part of the United States. And again, to point what Bob was saying earlier, there is a need to be able to continue to have contact, to be able to have visits, to be able to have summits that allow for the different partners to be able to get together, to be able to discuss these outstanding issues, because if there is not dialogue, there's going to be absolutely no hope in the future for being able to have a better relationship between our two countries.
Liang, I'm going to get back to the visit very soon back to China by the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen. In fact, you know, before this, she pointed to the visits being made by cabinet officials to China and said that it's indicative of that desire by the Biden administration to improve ties. I mean, we're already seeing lower level work being done in sort of, you know, concerning regulatory mechanisms, concerning financial markets. Where do you see it heading?
Right. I think, first of all, I want to just go back to the discussion about, you know, how China is a threat or not. I think, first of all, we need to know that, you know, based on the PPP conversion, the Chinese economy is already on par with the U.S. economy. The Financial Times has just reported it. But I don't see there's any indications or substantive evidence that China is intending to displace the United States or to turn the U.S. into a vassal state. I think that is quite clear. So all these talking about, you know, threat, I think is really lacking any substance. Now, going back to your question, I think you're right. There is a very bifurcated approach. On the one hand, there is a continuation of diplomatic engagements, but on the other hand, the de-risking strategy is, you know, being doubled down by the Biden administration. So this, you know, ban the high-tech exports, restrain investments, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, I see, you know, people like Janet Yellen and other officials, they're much more pragmatic. They are trying to, you know, for example, have coordinations in climate change, also in regulatory framework, also in some of the international, you know, emergencies like that crises. So on all those fronts, I think the United States does want to kind of cooperate and collaborate with China. Now, the question is, can they continue to play this kind of compartmentalization game, which I don't think China is in favor of.
Robert, coordination on how to battle climate change. We just heard that there. This is an area where these two countries have worked together for a long time, for many, many years. In fact, they were key to the adoption of the Paris Accords almost 8 years ago. And there was agreement at the COP28 summit that just took place for nations to transition away from fossil fuels. That agreement was brokered by the Chinese climate envoy, Xi Jinping, and his U.S. counterpart, John Kerry. Well, this is what Xi Jinping and John Kerry had to say after COP28. Let's listen.
We, fortunately, were able to come to agreement with China and the United States that we are, as the two largest emitters in the world, obviously, we understand it's important for us to be able to find cooperation here. No one country, no business anywhere in the world will solve this problem by itself.
And here in Dubai, we have already achieved part of what we agreed at Sunnylands, namely working together to promote the success of COP28. When negotiations got bogged down, we worked together and presented common proposals to unblock the negotiations and facilitate the success of the COP. So I would like to thank Secretary Kerry and his team for their cooperation.
So, Robert, at a time when there are now serious challenges to meeting that 1.5-degree target, do you see a lot more cooperation between these two countries, especially on the issue of climate change?
Well, I think if there's one area where there can be mutual benefit and real progress, and where the basis of that progress has already been established as a result of the conversations that you just mentioned, it's climate, and both sides have a big interest in a climate agreement and in climate cooperation, because if they don't, then the world is never going to meet the targets that have been set at COP28, and Chinese and Americans will both be the losers as a result of that. So this is something that's good for the world, but it's also good for the citizens of both countries. And I would say that in terms of domestic politics, there is a strong feeling among Chinese that dealing with environmental issues, clean air, clean water, etc., is a very high priority, just as it is in the United States. So there are a lot of common interests to be served in this environment. They haven't, unfortunately, talked to one another before relatively recently, but I do think it's an area where progress can be made and must be made. The second area is cooperation on health and medical issues, where there's a long history between the two countries, scientists and doctors and research centers in dealing with viruses and dealing with various types of pathogens. And this goes back for a century as another area where I think bright minds on both sides need to work together for the interests of the common good and their own natural.
Robert, we're rapidly running out of time, and I want to ask you about the recent death of the former U.S. Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, who played a very big role in developing relations between the two countries. Here is the Chinese Foreign Minister, Wang Yi, talking, or reflecting rather, on Kissinger's legacy. Let's listen.
He was particularly good at discovering common ground from the differences between China and the U.S. and finding opportunities for cooperation. He had actively explored the China-U.S. relationship from a perspective of the whole world and humankind. There is one thing he had always believed would remain unchanged. That is, China and the U.S. as two powers should or must live with each other peacefully.
So, Robert, you were both a friend and a colleague of Henry Kissinger. What did he leave behind?
I think he left behind two things. One was he helped Americans at a time when we had not had a relationship with China for several decades. He helped Americans understand why China was important and why a relationship with China was important. But second, looking forward, I think he had the view that you've just sort of reflected in the conversation, that if you're going to deal with global issues, in the world of the 21st century, the two great global superpowers have to be able to work together. If they don't, then there's mutual assured disruption between the two countries, but also for many, many other countries. So I think he saw this as a critical bilateral issue, but also a critical issue in terms of a more stable world that would benefit a lot of other countries. And a lot of other countries don't want to be in the middle of a big conflict between China and the U.S. They want to be able to have the option of working with both countries, and I think he understood that.
Victor, how do you assess Kissinger's legacy?
Thank you very much for asking this very important question. I was Dr. Henry Kissinger's interpreter in 1985 and in 1987 when he visited China as private citizen. And I think Dr. Henry Kissinger's legacy is truly recognizing the importance of both China and the United States on the global scene and try to make the best of it. And he is not only a bridge builder, but also he opened the door between China and the United States. And I understand in the last months of his time, he was very much committed and devoted to promoting cooperation between China and the United States in terms of AI, because he realized that AI left on its own may actually become a major menace to mankind as a whole. And only when China and the United States can cooperate, come up with a framework of cooperation, will mankind eventually be triumph rather than we be subjugated to AI eventually.
Right, James, I've only got a minute left, but I want to talk about the meeting that President Xi Jinping had with business leaders that took place on the sidelines of that same APEC leaders meeting in San Francisco back in November. And the president of China said that China was open for business and, quote, peaceful coexistence between China and the United States will not change. I mean, listening to that, do you see business actually driving this relationship forward in the months and the year ahead?
Yes, indeed. I think that business is going to have an incredible lead role in the future between our two countries. I think it's also important to mention at least the elephant that's in the room that business people are certainly going to be watching very closely in the United States, and that's the question of the upcoming elections in November of next year. There's going to be a lot of rhetoric that's going to be thrown across the transom, and I think that's going to be concerning on the part of a lot of people. But again, business is going to be taking a cue not only from Beijing, but also from Washington.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.